Now, our second review is a bit different because we are actually going to outside rock music now, and a band who I don't necessarily know how much of the TNM audience are like, the audience to be anticipating this band's new music, but they are a band inextricably tied to alternative culture, and this is a pretty important record for them, I think, that at least I wanted to talk about. I'll ask you too in a minute if you share that, but it's Depeche Mode and their 15th album, Memento Mori. Objectively, this is one of the biggest albums we will talk about this year, in that over the course of this year, they are doing a stadium tour for it around the world. Depeche Mode are still massive. They are one of those absolute giant bands like, The Cure or, I don't know, U2, whoever, whose place on the pedestal is never really going to be dislodged. And in the kind of critical pop world, I guess, not the pop charts and what's actually blowing up there, because it's obviously way past Depeche Mode's time in that regard, but if you look at any outlets that are covering a broader range of music, Depeche Mode albums are events. Like, if Q magazine still existed, they'd probably be on the cover of it right now. But that doesn't necessarily explain us and what we're doing here. Elliot, you like a broad range of kind of classic artists from the annals of music history. Are you a Depeche Mode fan?
I don't even call it a funny relationship. I fucking love the run of Black Celebration, which is my favourite. Music for the Masses, Violator, and Songs of Faith and Devotion, I think, is one of the best runs of records that at least this kind of music has ever produced.
It's like, any kind of music.
Yeah, like no fat the whole way through, and so much variety and subversiveness. And I think that's one of the things that makes them, like, it didn't feel like a leap for me when you said we were doing it this week. So I kind of thought they're so subversive and so willing to be dark and so influential on a lot of the bands we would talk about, that despite their size and despite them ostensibly being a pop group, it feels completely appropriate here. I will say that despite that, I wouldn't call myself an obsessive, and they're not necessarily a band that I eagerly await new music for or new music from, because I have the records I love, but for whatever reason I've never felt particularly compelled to kind of go deep on the late stuff. So I hadn't heard the last couple of Depeche Mode records going into this, so I kind of didn't know what exactly to expect.
Yeah, I mean, you can be a fan of a band's, peak era run without necessarily being obsessed following everything they do over a 40-year career. I think that's entirely fair enough. Sam, you and I are going to see Depeche Mode on the London date of their stadium tour for this. So for that alone, I thought it would be interesting just to talk about what you made of the record. I think, if you are a rock fan who, like Elliot is saying, if you have even the haziest idea of stuff from outside rock music that has been massively inspirational for a lot of our favourite artists, records like, Violator and Songs of Faith and Devotion, which has been an album club on this show, it warrants that amount of attention, kind of speak for themselves. But does your appreciation of Depeche Mode kind of similarly, extend to following through their newer material? Because that's where I think the general disconnect might be.
So that again is where I line up with Elliot in that I adore those records. I like scattered songs throughout there, but the Depeche Mode are kind of a more recent kind of thing where I've really delved into and got into them in recent years. So, like, I've got a lot of catching up to, and again, I've still got a lot of Depeche Mode records I want to check out and want to dive into, especially some of the ones that, like, before we go see them. But this was very much like I really got into those classic, again, records that are not rock records but are so important to so many bands that we big up and hype. Like, again, where would AFI be without some of those Depeche Mode records? Like, things like that. Like, they're so important on some of the latter AFI stuff. But that's what kind of got me to go back and really appreciate Depeche Mode, essentially. And so I've, again, not listened to all the latter day stuff, not listened to every sort of classic era record, but really love what I have heard from this band.
Yeah, I think so. Basically, both of you are what I would say the majority position, because, like, those classic records are fucking classics. You've got to be, in on the Depeche Mode fandom to have really gone in on everything. They are fascinating in that they are like one of those enormously massive cult bands in that way, where, like, outside of the heavy hitters, they have a properly dedicated ride or die fan base who are interested in where the band continues to go. And they don't actually do nostalgia very much. Like, they have a trademark sound, but they're not one of those older bands who are, like, constantly trying to recapture old glories. And when they release new records, they do tend to play a fair bit of them in set lists. This one is significant, on a personal note, because it's the one that we're going to go see them on. So naturally, I'm a little more drawn to getting inside it. But also, it's the record we didn't necessarily know would exist because of the passing of Andy Fletcher last year, who, for Depeche Mode newbies, he was kind of always seen as, like, the steadying hand in the band amongst the main three who had been there since day one. Martin Gore and Dave Garn, these, like, kind of opposing forces. And Andy Fletcher, like, more so than being a key songwriter, was kind of the anchor. I am elated to have Depeche Mode, like, you know, finding the way to continue on, both in the sense of, you know, getting to see them, but also getting more music that I am interested in from an artist who I really love. I think the natural thing to do would be to expect this to be quite a heavy listen. I don't know how much of that is due to, you know, the death of Fletch, or how much it was going to be moving towards something more introspective anyway, because their last album in 2017, Spirit, was like their big kind of political Trump comment record, and then obviously you had the pandemic. But Depeche Mode here made like a real kind of headphones late night kind of record. Like, I would warn against going into this expecting huge pop bangers if you are more casual with Depeche Mode. This is a record that really rewards patience.
Yeah, this is immersive is the kind of the obvious word to kind of go for this record. Like, late night headphones kind of sink into it, because again, I was expecting something. I've not listened to a lot of the latter ones, but I was like, given the situations, I was like, this is going to be a darker, more introspective record. It was kind of what I expected, with the kind of the spectre of death looming over it, whether that again was entirely because of Andy Fletcher's passing, or if they were just, you know, as bands get older, they might like linger on these things more. But this is, yeah, not an immediate album, but if you can like just sink into its world, I think this is really like fascinating and immersive and engaging.
Well, I reckon there aren't many bands that are as conducive to aging gracefully as Depeche Mode. And I think obviously a big part of that is because their music's, you know, primarily made with synthesizers, which helps because it's not rooted in like a physical performance in a way. But also, they've always had this quality that they're sort of like almost old before their time. Not necessarily because like just can't get enough, but there's something kind of, I don't know what the quality is necessarily, but something about even those classic records where they sound like an older band. And for me, the whole thing of the death of Andy Fletcher, I didn't really know precisely what his role in the band was, so I wasn't sure what a departure was going to be. But it meant that despite not really following Depeche Mode after those classic years, I went into this with some level of expectation. Like, I kind of thought I didn't think they'd do it just, you know, for a folly. I thought they'd only do it if they got something worthwhile out of it, and they absolutely have.
Yeah, I was definitely like, you know, I was struck by the general vibe of this album at first. A few listens deep, where this has been the main thing I've been listening to in like the last week, I've gotten really, really into it, to the point that I think it's potentially their best record this side of the century. And I like a lot of those as well. Like, I've got a particular soft spot for Delta Machine from 2013, and that's a record that no one else seems to talk about, right? Like, I'm a big Depeche Mode fan who will generally like what they do and keep up with their music, but this one has a consistency in its kind of identity and its mood and its ideas that I think is kind of its own beast.
Yeah, I think that consistency is like a big thing, like, because again, it is all quite low key a lot of the time. It does a lot with a little, in a way, where like it's quite minimalist at points, but it then layers in things really subtly, and it's a really classy sounding way. And that, like, even when you're kind of getting some of the more big kind of beats and synths coming through, it's never garish, it's never like overbearing. It's subtly woven in a way that just kind of will lift a track. And again, I also was saying, what I think one of the amazing qualities of this record is, whilst it is a dark, introspective record, it's not dour, it's not upsetting. Like, it is really uplifting at the same time, and how it kind of like weighs in on life and death and looks at a lot of these aspects.
Yeah, well, My Cosmos Is Mine, which will almost certainly be what they're opening with, built on this, you know, really menacing, crackling kind of industrial, you know, beat and bass line stuff. It's one of the most striking openings Depeche Mode have had to a record in a while. And then Dave's vocal come in, and it's like this really like echoing, heavy, bassy kind of manner. The whole thing is really immersive to the ear. And then Martin's vocal part comes in all of a sudden with
the no fear bit,
and it's, you know, layering up on itself, and it's weirdly kind of upbeat, but it's like, you know, kind of sinister in its jolliness in the context of that, you know, part. It's like hearing fucking Tiptoe Through the Tulips reverberate through the room in Insidious or something like that.
It was a weird opener for me, because as sort of panic-inducing and alarming as it has a sort of a day-in-the-life use of strings, or the way they sort of wail and groan and that sort of thing. So when that came in, obviously the immediate response is to kind of feel a bit tensed up. I actually found it quite a sort of comforting and ear-catching way to start the record, because my worry, if there was any worry, was that it would be like, if you ever listen to one of the recent Duran Duran albums or one of the new Gary Newman albums, you're just like, well, you want to be a pop band, like an actual popular pop band in the 2020s, and it's not going to happen. We listen to the Gary Newman album, and you go, you want to be Trent Reznor so badly. Listening to this, the Depeche Mode DNA was so immediately present, but it showed such like a level of almost restraint and class that it was okay. Even though I went in with expectations, already they've been kind of met, and I've been assured.
Yeah, I think sonically, when you hear these songs, like how they're put together, all these parts, they're immaculate. And it's Depeche Mode, they sound very like classic Depeche Mode still now. And synth pop like this, it naturally has a certain era that it is tied to. But production-wise, how they've maintained this kind of like high level of fidelity, it makes stuff like this like all the more fulfilling to sit into. Like Wagging Tongue, which that transitions into, I don't think it's one of the standout tracks on the record necessarily. Maybe if it had gone into something a little bit more kind of pacey, like Before We Drown or Never Let Me Go, whatever, it'd be a bit more of kind of a wow factor. But it's sonically so well put together like that. And, you know, some of Depeche Mode's best records are these quite, you know, intense experiences that sit in a particular mood, often after something major has happened. Like Ultra springs to mind after kind of Dave Gahan's like peak heroin years, and that's probably the last like widely seen as classic Depeche Mode record. I think this falls quite similarly to something like that, but for their modern era. I think Ghosts Again was the single. It's maybe like the sweetest moment on the record. One of the great things about Depeche Mode is how human they sound, right? Because you know, it's synth pop, and they came from the 1980s when it was the era of like, oh, robotics taking over music, let's all be androids and all this kind of shit. And that is this really like straightforward classic like pop ballad almost, I guess. It's this really earnest, melodically straightforward song, and fuck do they sell it and imbue it with so much genuine feeling. I
genuinely think I might tear up when we see that live Ghosts Again.
Yeah,
it has
it's amazing.
Really hit me, because the thing like that, it's this kind of like the call and response kind of vocal delivery is like he's like having a conversation with himself almost, kind of like weighing up, and it is like it's so tender and you're right, human in its delivery of like the whole like we'll be ghosts again. It's kind of like accepting that you'll see each other again after everything.
It's like this huge hug into the kind of afterlife that they are singing about.
And it's got this really pretty but warm synth sound to it that is uplifting. And this is what I'm saying when I say like when I'm saying this album is dark and sad but so uplifting at the same time in how it can find peace in these subjects. And I think like Ghosts Again is such a perfect crystallization of that I'm like really been the song I've been listening to the most at the moment, because I just think I'm so just wowed by it every time. Like, and again, I liked it as a single, but when it comes in on the album after like Wagging Tongues, I think lifts things up a bit, but Ghosts Again is just that extra level coming out, which is just incredible.
Ghosts Again was the first like real wow moment for me listening to this, because one of them, like you say, the thing about them being human, but one of the things that Depeche Mode do so brilliantly is the way they walk that line between kind of darkness and light, where like Personal Jesus, for example, just to pick a big hit, or Enjoy the Silence, same thing. On one hand, party tune. On the other hand, these sort of depraved, subversive, glowering songs. And this, it doesn't necessarily have that quality, but the way it struts along with that like bittersweet piano riff and the pain delivery of the vocals, it's just, I mean, like you say, it's hard not to get a lump in your throat, like given the context of everything surrounding it, and just such a, like, again, the whole thing of like, they sound like they've aged, but not like they've wilted or gotten like any worse or like lost it at all. It's just such a classy and well realized way to really almost start the record proper. Because like you say, Wagging Tongues I think is good, but this is really when you go, oh, like fuck, Depeche Mode. You're reminded what an amazing band they are. Yeah, when this record goes dark though, Don't Say You Love Me really jumped out at me, because it's like this brooding kind of ghost waltz almost, where it's got those like, you know, arpeggiated guitar chords that have so much dark character in them, and then these strings that are like pure, you know, doomed kind of romance. Like, it's so high gloss and high production value, like it could be a Bond song or something, but it doesn't sacrifice all of that fucking oppressive atmosphere in it. Yeah, and that song, the way they change the time signatures so effortlessly, like, that's not a common move in synth pop, because obviously the whole point is the beat and staying locked in, but the willingness to kind of, you know, dance around and change the tempo, it's again, I think it just adds to that sort of human quality.
Yeah, and there are also these parts in it when Dave kind of moves up to these higher notes of kind of like, oh, and in the context of this like slow burn type song, it made me think about Scott Walker. And I think when you were saying about them aging, like Dave Gahan has a voice, because it was never in like a super high register, it hasn't really been dampened by age very much.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
he still just prowls all over this record in that kind of baritone. But stuff like that, or the way that he kind of narrates on My Cosmos Is Mine, beginning to kind of tap into that kind of, you know, like Leonard Cohen or Scott Walker kind of like storyteller darkness, instead of just
Yeah.
kind of like, you know, pure sex machine that you might immediately think about. And that's a really interesting thing to have, especially in this more stark record.
That sort of 1-2 of Don't Say You Love Me and My Favourite Strangers being really nailing that dark storyteller thing, getting both going kind of different routes with it, where Don't Say You Love Me is like a pure gothic ballad with these strings, but it is still really unsettling. And again, that like twisted romance in the lyricism
Yeah.
of You Be the Killer, I'll Be the Corpse. Like, it's morbid yet classy. Like, I think
Caroline's Monkey is like maybe one of Depeche Mode's weirdest ever moments, kind of him narrating this fucking, you know, description about a monkey, and I don't quite know what it's meant to represent, but these, you know, the way he kind of says these details against this like dark 80s beat is quite, you know, surreal and unsettling.
yeah, it's got a really catchy chorus, that one, though. Like,
Yeah, I thought that was a really excellent addition to the record, because, as you say, it stands out a lot, but it's so craftwork in its musical canvas, and it's one of those things where, as nice as it is to hear Depeche Mode sound like an older version of themselves, it is nice, especially on this record, where, you know, there's the weight of the loss of Andy Fletcher and that sort of thing. And Kraftwerk was probably, I presume, a major influence on especially their early years. So to have something which directly draws on that, and as you say, in one of their weirdest songs, it's such a kind of fun and daring thing for a band to do 40 years deep.
Yeah, and then kind of around that point in the record is when you start getting those mean, you know, stealthy kind of groovers that they maintain that the bubble that the album lives in, but have that more of that dark dance floor energy, where the bass line in My Favourite Stranger kind of, you know, carrying that beat. I just love that. It oozes that kind of that goth club sleaze. And then the same with Before We Drown, which makes me think of Hesitation Marks era Nine Inch Nails, which is obviously like the kind of influence in reverse there, but that kind of like the texture and like, you know, the looping of those kind of like, you know, bleeping parts like up over each other to make this much more involving beat as a whole. My two favourites, I think, are getting even further into the album. People Are Good and Never Let Me Go, where People Are Good, if you are a Depeche Mode fan, you will probably unavoidably have your mind brought to People Are People when you hear that, because it's one of their big hits from the 80s, and that's this like big, you know, hey, we're all the same underneath, so why should we hate each other song. It's been very associated with, like, you know, gay rights parades and anti-racism movements, that kind of thing. It's very bright and hopeful, right? People Are Good is like 35 to 40 years of people being cunts later, being kind of jaded with the idea of giving people the benefit of the doubt and having to forcefully remind himself. You know, the beat is really thick and nasty, and the vocal part, you know, keep telling myself people are good, whisper it under my breath. Like, it's got like a frustrated, nervous, annoyed energy to it. Like, you know, I do believe still that people at their cores are good, but God, they fucking make it difficult.
I hadn't even thought of that. Like, I hadn't made the connection between People Are Good and People Are People, and it makes that song seem almost all the more significant in the track list, because, you know, like I said, as nice as it is for bands to push things forward, and in terms of a musical canvas, I think it does. But if that is a reference to one of their early hits,
even if it's not
that's
conscious,
a clever
at
move.
the very least, it's these people revisiting an idea 40 years later or something, and just seeing that kind of that, you know, where they've gone with that idea.
yeah, no, I think that definitely feels like a through line. But yeah, People Are Good, just having that more driving sort of beat and intensity. And I think the same was Never Let You Go being one of the more like intense tracks. Again, relative to the rest of the album, but they those kind of just up the sort of thing and keep it from ever sinking into feeling like too much of like a repetitive, like one pace record. They just, those sort of changes here and there towards the back end are like really vital in kind of keeping it engaging.
Yeah, well, I mean, those kind of like beats and bass lines, I think, you know, since the last Depeche Mode album came out in 2017, I think we've spoken even more about stuff in the walls of alternative music, kind of drawing on that kind of sound, where Depeche Mode has always been the obvious reference point.
Yeah.
So it's just really good to hear, you know, the daddies of that stuff doing it. There was still so much darkness wrapped up in it. There are these parts where you get these like screaming industrial type sound on the record as well. You know, it provides a kind of counterpoint to the beat in My Favorite Stranger, and you get these, you know, these more inhuman sounds kind of, you know, ripping through the higher registers of the record that makes this interesting tension. And my favorite example of that is Never Let Me Go, which the way it uses those kind of abrasive guitar riffs and stuff, it's almost like Depeche Mode doing an old Joy Division song or something. It's like this kind of mechanized She's Lost Control drum beat, the descending like doomy bass line, and then these really jagged guitars. And Garn fucking kills that track where he does those more kind of unsettled, you know, Scott Walker-y moans in the early verses, and then it's like the biggest moment on the album of turning on the snarl when he does the I have been patient, I have been so calm. It's like rock star Dave Garn like arriving into the record. That song fucking rules.
Yeah, I think My Favorite Stranger is my favorite for doing that with like the mechanized guitars just actually sounding mean and nasty. But that one again, like that same kind of feeling of just like getting a dark, like not just dark, but having like something that actually sounds menacing and mean on there as well within it, without sounding without sounding forced either. Where it just feels like a natural part of the sound.
Well, it felt to me like kind of a slightly new move for Depeche Mode, maybe, because they've been dark and aggressive in the past, but even then, you're kind of sound like you're slipping into a bath of bubbling black oil. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. There's still a sort of like a smooth quality to it, but they very rarely sounded kind of angular and aggressive in this way. And again, to be doing that so late at the exact point where you think that would be least fitting of their sound, and is one of the highlights of the entire record, is such a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, I fucking love that song. And then in the middle, you've got Soul With Me, where every album has a mandatory Martin Gore sing this ballad, which normally they can be some of the weaker moments on the record, and you know they're going to be something they do live as well, because Martin always likes to take over for a bit while Dave goes and have a break. With that in mind, I was relieved to think that Soul With Me is like one of the best ones they've done in that particular lane, certainly of late. It has this really woozy feel that's in line with the rest of the record, that kind of, it's not quite, you know, Nick Cave Ghosteen or something, but that kind of floating through space really, really works there, and it's really pretty as well. It's like Martin Gore's singing with kind of like that, you know, that Afterlife choir or something, rather than just very, very bare as some of them have been.
I quite like sort of the more like that like gospel choir thing you're saying on it, like that, giving it a bit more of like a sort of beefed out the sound. But yeah, I think it's a really nice sort of track, and it fits in with the vibe of the record. And again, lyrically, I think there's so much in this record that the lyrics I can just really read and go like, it all flows together and links up, the themes it covers, and it doesn't feel like an out of place shift in the record.
No, and then like Speak to Me closing the record as well. They have these calm songs that still have this really heavy air around them.
Yeah, Speak to Me kind of felt like a kind of bookend to My Cosmos' Mind, because they kind of both played with that sort of unsettling string wail quality, but they did it to really different effects. I think actually as a closer, Speak to Me had this sort of like feeling of ascension that I don't think My Cosmos' Mind did. Not as a criticism, but just the way they use that tool for different effects. It's maybe a slightly odd comparison, but it was a use of noise in a way that for me wasn't too dissimilar to someone like Boris, the way they would do it in the 90s, where it would just be that sort of squalling feedback thing, but you felt like you were, you know, suspended in space. Again, I don't know if that's a direct influence on Depeche Mode in 2023, but either way, just as a way to close the record, kind of the opposite of what I was saying about Lonely Desires on Glow On earlier. It's just like, it feels like such a closing of the book in just the best way.
Yeah, I think the scene that Depeche Mode started in, they were peers with like Yazoo, and Yazoo aren't doing records like this, you know what I mean, where you would never talk about Scott Walker and Boris and kind of them getting more, you know, kind of angular and you know, kind of unsettling in a way. Like, that's why I think it's worth following records like this. I mean, the funny thing is they've made this really insular slow burn type record, and we're still going to see it at fucking Twickenham Stadium. So like,
that's the crazy
we'll see
thing,
how it translates, I guess.
Like, I mean, I think Ghosts again will be a moment, but like, I'm really interested to see how this goes. And again, I think it's just one of those things that makes Depeche Mode interesting. They're not a band who are just, you know, they could coast on nostalgia if they wanted. They've got enough records that are of just like 10 out of 10 classics. They could just rely on that for the rest of their career. But that they are still looking to push themselves and do stuff that feels creatively fulfilling to them, I think makes them such a valuable band to have around. And it just, I mean, this album, they didn't have to, you know, really go to these darker places if they wanted to, but it's so genuine and affecting. And that's the thing I like. This is clearly a difficult album, but it's handled with such class and dignity that I think makes it special.
Yeah, like, there are so many songs I really like on this record. Like, you know, and I know where we are, and I know where Depeche Mode are at in their career. This isn't going to be like a TNM, you know, listener voted album in the top 20 at the end of the year. I don't even know how many of you guys would have listened to this before I was bringing it to your attention. But at the very least, it's an important record from a band who we all should all respect. And I'm really happy with it, both that it exists and that I actually think it's as good as it is. And that actually we all seem to think it's as good as that as well. Like, I don't know if it was just me kind of fawning over it, but this seems to be a success.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you think about their peers, like I mentioned, Duran Duran, like, yeah, they seem like nice guys, but it's a bit, you know, Ant and Dec's Saturday Night Takeaway at this point. Yeah, I mean, you're not getting any of this on ITV as Saturday night, but it will sell more tickets than Duran Duran, which I think is a promising thing